Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 4. This week we're going to be talking about a couple things. We're actually going to first talk about schools and delinquency, and then we are going to switch gears and talk about the family's role in delinquency. So this first part in talking about schools covers performance objectives 2, 5, and 6. And so we're going to talk about how in school it really is composed of more than just learning. We're going to talk a little bit about the United States and how we rate. And then we're going to shift gears and talk about some of the problems and specifically looking at truancy. So let's go ahead and begin with first talking about how school is really more than learning. Ultimately, in school is really where kids are going to shape their value systems. Now, of course, that begins in the family, but it's in school that they're really going to ultimately shape what their value system is going to be. We also see their reliance shifting here from early reliance on their family ultimately to their peers. And now I use a bullet to try to explain that, and I know I use a bullet in talking about criminology of place as well, so I probably overuse bullets a little bit. But ultimately, the radio concept is this idea. So the child is the nucleus, and so ultimately, and just like a cell is built, that nucleus is first most dependent on what is closest to it, and so that's going to be the family. Then the radio concept says once that things change, such as entering school, we shift to more dependence on the peers, and then ultimately it ends with those in the community and others around us. One of the things that when we talk about someone's future, we know that their future economic and social status, now remember we talked about social class and how that involves more than just money, but ultimately when we're looking at that as a whole, we know that someone's success in school is directly related to their future cash income, really is what it boils down to. And so we ultimately know it's important for a lot of reasons. As far as how do we rate, it's kind of interesting and it's kind of a paradox. The United States is the richest country in the world, yet we spend among the least of all countries on education, which is really sad. We now spend more on incarceration than we do education. All right, when we're looking at educational problems, unfortunately, it begins very, very early. There was a study done that said less than 1 in 5 children are unprepared for kindergarten, and many of these kids come from homes that are at the poverty level. And this study was done a few years ago, and this is really interesting in that to help you understand just how important doing research like this is of course, the president in recent years and then individual state governors followed suit in providing better access to preschool for everyone. You know, I look at my first son, and basically if we wanted him to go to preschool, it was a private preschool that we had to pay for. And so we have seen a shift to more preschool opportunities and more that are being offered through the public school system. So there's no fee for the parents. They're even offering buses for that in some jurisdictions. Truancy is the most frequent status offense for those age 15 and under. Now, we've talked about that a little bit already, and we know that's kind of a trick question because ultimately many states allow students to stop attending school at age 16. And so, you know, that makes sense that it's the most common for those under 15. I live in Minnesota, and we have what is known as compulsory attendance laws. And so ultimately in the state of Minnesota, a child must attend school until age 18 or an equivalency degree has been reached. And that's interesting because we are ranked second among the lowest of truancy rates. So Minnesota is very proud of that, and part of that stems from our compulsory attendance laws. And ultimately, we focus so much on truancy because we know there is a direct correlation between school success and delinquency. Kids who don't see school success are more likely to become delinquent, and just the opposite is true. Kids that see great success in school are the least likely to become delinquent. So we know it's hugely important. Now, ultimately, because of this, we have seen the government combining forces with two different agencies, and it's a partnership for truancy prevention is what it's formally been called. And so what that partnership is between the OJJDP, the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, and the Department of Education have joined forces to create what they call the National Center for School Engagement. And ultimately, this center really focuses on three things, and they all just happen to be words that start with A. And so first and foremost, they focus on attendance. Quite obviously, if a child is not in school, they can't be learning. And so again, that's why we focus so much on truancy, but attendance is that first A. Attachment. A child needs to be either attached to someone at the school, whether it be a teacher, paraprofessional, staff member. They need to feel attached to either a person or a thing, something at school that they feel a personal connection to. And so that level of attachment is very, very important. They also need to feel success, and that's where achievement. And that was actually one of the reasons between the No Child Left Behind Act. Now, of course, that act had a lot of problems, has since then ceased to exist. Really, it's just been kind of replaced with something else. But that's one of the reasons we have IEPs for children that might have some type of learning disability or other issues that might impact their ability to learn. All kids need to feel a sense of success. And so achievement is hugely important. Now, I'm not going to spend the time in this lecture because it is 14 minutes long, but the National Center for School Engagement has a video on their website called Strategies That Work, Truancy Initiative Strategies. It's a 14-minute video, and I would really encourage you to go take a look at that. All right, now this slide is just a quick visual. I put this in my announcement this week as well, in that it's showing how those 3 A's all lead to school success. And really, this partnership is not just a government agency. We need to ultimately see the family being involved. We know the community is involved. And ultimately, we need to be offering quality programs in our school in order for all 3 of these A's to happen. So the partnership goes far beyond just the OJJDP and the Department of Ed. All right, so why do we focus so much on truancy? Now, if you remember, I don't remember if it was last week or the week before, I apologize for that. Remember Travis Hershey and his social bonding theory. And basically, his theory was built on looking at why kids don't commit delinquency. And ultimately, Travis Hershey, and the math, and why I have the math up there, is it's really an equation in kids who feel attachment, and that's, of course, one of the 3 A's. They are committed to school, they are involved in school, and they believe that school is a means to an end. Those kids are least likely to become delinquent. So ultimately, we focus on truancy because it's really incorporating Travis Hershey's theory, the social bonding theory, which is one of our leading, it has been leading since 1969. It is one of our primary theories that we have. And so this equation is what I like to call the new math. Now, in my own personal life, I'm struggling a little bit on how my kids are learning math, just because it's different and it's hard to help them. But ultimately, the new math is if we can reduce truancy, or kids that are truancy tend to fail school and they drop out. Ultimately, dropping out of school is one of the biggest risks for delinquency, and delinquency and dropping out of school can also lead to future psychological issues, which, again, is one of the risk factors for delinquency. So it's really, you know, we're stuck behind a rock in a hard place. And so that's why, again, we focus so much on truancy prevention. All right, let's go ahead and shift gears, and we're going to take a look at the family and the family's role in delinquency. And for the most part, this focuses just on the performance objective number 2 of your syllabus. But we're going to look at the family's influence on delinquency. We're going to spend just a little bit of time talking about child development. I posted an announcement earlier this quarter quite in depth about child development, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time. And then ultimately we're going to talk about the influence of the family. Now, I just explained that radio concept. And again, we have that child, when we look at this as a cell, we have a child in the middle, the family, the school, and the community. And I've also in recent lectures talked about protective and risk factors. Of course, a protective factor is things that buffer us and insulate us, keep us safe or protected from delinquency. Risk factors are pretty self-explanatory. They're things that put us at risk. And ultimately, in this radio concept, these 3 pieces, the family, the peers, and the community, each can be a protective factor, each can be a risk factor. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that throughout the quarter, but for the next few minutes I'm going to focus on the role of that family. Now ultimately we have what are called categories of family dysfunction, and some of this is not necessarily politically correct, but just please bear with me, and I'll kind of explain where the political correctness is not happening. Ultimately, the first category of family dysfunction is a family breakup, or often referred to as a broken home. Now that term, again, drives me crazy, but that's where we know a lot of the issues are, and ultimately when we talk about a broken home, most people know what you are referring to. We know that the current divorce rate, you are more likely to be divorced, to get divorced, than you are to stay married. It's the state of affairs in our country right now. And so that is a category of family dysfunction that can lead to issues that might lead to delinquency. We also know that blended families have even a higher divorce rate. And so that is one of the issues that can lead to family dysfunction, which can impact delinquency rates. What's interesting is we see gender differences in both of these issues, but for different reasons. For example, boys who experience an absent father. So dad gets the kids on the weekends, dad gets every other week, whatever it is, when the father is absent, the boys are influenced by that absent father more so than girls are. They tend to have more issues that can be related back to that absent father. Girls are more influenced by what we call post-divorce conflict. So mom and dad have to go to court to get things, visitation figured out. Mom and dad are always back in court, and when there's dropping off, picking up, there's great tension. And girls are more influenced by that conflict than boys are. All right, the second category is family conflict. So we know the risks of divorce, and so I hear a lot of people saying, you know what, we're staying together for the kids, so they don't divorce. But ultimately, their relationship is domestically violent. There might be verbal abuse, physical abuse, and ultimately we know one of the biggest risk factors for juvenile delinquency is either witnessing or experiencing violence. And so for lack of better terms, and pardon my French, is we're damned if we do and damned if we don't in a lot of these situations. The third category is family competency. And ultimately, one of the risk factors that we've already talked about is inconsistent or ineffective supervision. Parents need to work a couple jobs and just can't be there and can't afford to be sending their kids somewhere else, so they're left at home alone. Or there's inconsistent. One of the things, one of my sisters is a neuropsychologist focusing on youth. And since our first child was a baby, she has always stressed to us. We try not to influence or input her work too much in our lives, but she has always really focused on helping us make sure we are on the same page. She's like, I might not even not agree with how you're handling the situation, but you and Craig need to be on the same page. Parent efficacy, efficacy is just a fancy word for efficiency. And ultimately, this is how good you are at parenting. It is hard. It is the hardest job I've ever had in my life. Dealing with sex offenders who abuse 3-year-old little girls was easier than parenting. And how good you are. We know, of course, kids don't come with a manual. And so, you know, it's hard to learn, but how good you are and your competence at being a parent ultimately is going to greatly impact your child's future delinquency rates. And that's why, again, we're seeing so many more family support programs, parenting classes, those types of things. The last is family deviance. Basically, if the parents are criminals, it's going to stay in the family. We see it all too in when I worked in the field. I knew I was getting old when I was seeing grandchildren. I'd seen the dad, I'd seen the son, and then when I was working with juveniles, we would sometimes see the kids. And so we see a definite cycle there that really needs to be broken. All right, looking at a little bit of child development, ultimately age 1 to 3 is the most critical time. Ultimately, this is when a child is developing a conscience, and this is when they learn about consequences. By age 3, they've basically established their conscience and their feelings about consequences. There's huge brain cell development going on here, so their capacity to learn in the future is really developed in those first 3 years. One of the biggest pieces that happens in this time frame is conflict resolution. And so how they see the parent handling conflict is going to influence how they handle conflict. And one of the things that drives me crazy is when people talk about the terrible twos, and it's like it's an excuse to have bad behavior. Makes me crazy. It's not. You can't just let it go and call it the terrible twos. It doesn't work that way. And so, you know, again, because that's when kids are learning how to manage conflict and, you know, what consequences are about. And again, as we said, although it's hindsight, early aggression has been directly correlated to future delinquency. And so dealing and providing consequences for that early aggression is huge. I remember when my youngest was in this time frame, he was very aggressive in his personality, very physically aggressive, which is really interesting because Craig and I, my husband and I, are not. And so where he was getting this from is unknown, but we were able to nip it in the bud and you know, provided some very consistent consequences for that, and it basically went away. And so, knock on wood, we were successful with that. All right, over the next 15 years, of course, until the age of 18, hormones are running rampant, of course, with those adolescent, late adolescent, and early teenagers, and their level of stress. It is hard to be a kid. It is hard to be 13 to 18. And so we have to acknowledge that. And yes, and I remember even my parents going, you don't know what stress is. Wait till you're an adult. And that doesn't really help because their stress to them is very real. So just dismissing it, tell them that, oh, wow, what a thing to look forward to. So we have to acknowledge that their stress is real and give them tools to manage that stress. In that time frame, kids who are bored. Basically, and again, I've talked about the idle hands or the devil's workshop. If your child is telling you they're bored, you need to give them something constructive to do. That's not always unenjoyable. I remember me saying, Mom, I'm bored. Well, here's a mop, you know, or here's the dust rag. We need to provide them, and not everything has to be expensive. Sit down and play cards. You know, boredom with kids, especially kids who are unsupervised, they don't feel like they have anything to do, they're going to find something to do. And a lot of times it's not necessarily constructive. Over that time frame, kids whose friends are struggling or already committing delinquent acts is a huge risk factor for your own kids. And then being rejected by peers is a huge risk factor for future delinquency. All right, so the influence of that family, as I said, we can see them, the family can be the strongest protective factor. It also can be the greatest risk factor because it is so close to that nucleus of that radio concept. And so ultimately, when the family is a protective factor, It's also preventing delinquency. The family is their first teacher, is a child's first teacher, and that whole how to be social, how to live in our communities and our society ultimately is being taught by the parents first and foremost. And again, as I said, that parent efficiency or effectiveness, is the most important, yet as I said, they don't come with a manual. And so it's a hard job. Now, a lot of people ask me about spanking. Now, first and foremost, spanking is still legal. It is not illegal to spank your kids. It makes me crazy when people say that. The law in every single state, all 50 states, allow for physical discipline of your children. So there. Look at your state statute, look at what child abuse is, and all of them will allow for physical discipline. And basically, but that allowing for physical discipline, basically as long as it doesn't cause physical damage, then you've gone too far. Then it's child abuse. However, I would really encourage you, now I was spanked as a child. We choose not to spank our own children. I would really encourage you, if you spank your children, to look at why you're spanking your children. Spanking has ultimately been demonstrated through research to be reactive. It is not proactive. There is no research that supports by spanking your children, they will not do this something, whatever it was they got spanked for, again. The research is null. It's basically with folks that use other ways to curb behavior, there is no research that says spanking is more effective. And so if you're spanking to make yourself feel better, you might want to reconsider that. All right, as I already said, we know that family is ultimately their first teachers, and they're teaching that socialization process, and they're also teaching values, caring about others, compassion, working together. Kids don't just ultimately know those values. They have to be taught them. And ultimately the family is the first place that they are taught. When we talk about risk factors, probably the biggest risk factor is poverty. And when we're talking about poverty at different levels, poverty to the point of homelessness. Ultimately, when we look at the parents in a homelessness situation, the stress that the parents are under being homeless can lead to neglect and abuse of their children because of this stress. Not that it's an excuse, but we see it being correlated. Kids who are homeless have behavior problems in school, and that shouldn't surprise us. The triangle that I have on your screen is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Should look very familiar to you. And when we look at the basic needs, so ultimately with Maslow's hierarchy, before a child can be up here and learning and developing self-fulfillment or self-actualization, they need to have their basic psychological and safety needs met. If those needs aren't met down here, they can't go any higher. And so ultimately this is where homelessness has such a major impact on kids. We've already talked a little bit about this one. Kids who are exposed to lead. Now I'm not talking about being stabbed with a pencil. We're talking higher rates, lead paint, lead faucets and fittings of faucets in very old homes, predominantly low-income homes, still have lead in them. And we know that kids who are exposed to lead, it's been proven over and over and over again, impulsivity and aggression are higher in kids who have lead poisoning. Welfare dependence also has a lot of risk factors for kids in delinquency. We've already talked a little bit about this as well. Again, that absent parent, one-parent families. And again, I quite frankly said, a lot of times we're damned if we do and damned if we don't. But we know that's definitely a risk factor. Kids whose parents have no high school diploma are more likely to not value that and not achieve that. And so I've already talked about the role of school, and so we see that being directly correlated. Lastly, last two things, family size. The larger the family, the more kids they have, the more likely someone is to be is to become delinquency. Now, there's a lot of hypothetical theories on why that might be. You know, we can't spend as much time with each kid, poverty levels. I think it's kind of a combination of all. There are 2 million parents on any given day, any given hour. Approximately 2 million parents are incarcerated. And so we know that's a huge risk factor. All right, so that wraps up the content. Talking a little bit about the assignments this week. Read Chapter 4 in your textbook, as well as the links that are under the lesson plan. Again, those links are all fair game for the midterm and final exam. The discussion forum this week talks about a life of crime. Now, we've talked a lot about theories in the last few weeks, and so ultimately what your first discussion post needs to be is to discuss how one theory might demonstrate how changes in one's life could lead to a life of crime. Make sure you're incorporating a theory in that first discussion post. Your response post, this is the first time we've really articulated what must be in the response post. You need to respond to someone who chose a different theory or in a different example to apply their theory. So make sure you're taking a look at that when you come up with your response post. There is no writing assignment this week, but your project outline is due. And again, make sure you're looking at the feedback that I've been providing you on your project assignments so far. So you've done your topic selection, you've done your thesis statement. Take a look at my feedback. And ultimately, in this outline, remember the goals of this persuasive essay have already been established. You have already been informed exactly what you need to write about. No matter what your thesis statement is, what you're looking at, you need to look at its history, its current status, at least 2 benefits, 2 drawbacks, and lastly, your opinion. And so your outline needs to follow, why isn't it showing up here? There we go. Needs to follow this basic format. So first, your introduction. Now, I want an actual paragraph of what your introduction is going to be. It's going to include your thesis statement and a summary of what your paper is going to cover, which is basically the goals that have already been established. And then the next section of your outline is the historical context. You need to provide a couple pieces, and so your research needs to be at least somewhat completed. Again, that research needs to be scholarly. Look at the historical context, kind of follow it and how it's evolved. And then the current use and relevance, again, using scholarly research. What's the current context of your topic? 2 benefits that are supported with research. 2 drawbacks that are supported with research. And then your opinion. Make sure you're supporting your opinion, with research. And then lastly, your conclusion should reiterate. Now, it's not exactly, you don't just cut and paste your introduction. Basically, it's going to reiterate your thesis and how you demonstrated each piece of that summary. So that's what's due this week. As always, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. Have a great week.